You know you're getting old when your own family starts laughing before you even finish speaking, my daughter said at Christmas dinner. And everyone around the table smiled like it was the most natural thing in the world. I just smiled too. 3 days later, I found something on that same dining table that made me realize the laughter had never really been about a joke. I'm glad you're here. Stay with me until the end, and let me know where you're watching from because sometimes stories travel farther than people do. Christmas had always been my favorite time of year. I used to believe there was something magical about it. Something that softened people. Something that made families remember what mattered. Even after Thomas passed away 4 years ago, I still tried to keep the traditions alive. I still bake cinnamon cookies using the same recipe his mother had given me 40 years earlier. I still wrapped presents carefully with silver ribbons because Thomas always said silver looked like snow under candlelight. And I still wore the same dark green sweater every Christmas Eve because it had once made him stop in the kitchen and say, "Ellie, you look beautiful tonight." At 68 years old, some memories become part of your bones. You stop carrying them in your mind because they simply live inside you. That evening I stood outside Melissa's house holding a pumpkin pie in one hand and a gift bag in the other. Tiny snowflakes drifted through the air, landing on my coat sleeves before melting away. The neighborhood looked exactly like the Christmas cards people mail every December. White lights wrapped around maple trees. Wreaths hung on front doors. Small glowing reindeer sat on lawns covered in fresh snow. I remember standing there for a second before ringing the bell, and thinking maybe this year would feel different. Maybe this year things would feel warm again. Daniel opened the door with a smile. "Eleanor, Merry Christmas." He leaned forward and hugged me quickly before stepping aside. Warm air and the smell of roasted turkey spilled out into the cold night. I could hear Christmas music playing softly somewhere in the house. I walked inside and saw Melissa arranging dishes on the dining table, while Sophie sat on the couch scrolling through her phone. "Grandma!" Sophie jumped up and hugged me tightly. At 19, she still hugged me the same way she did when she was 6. Fully. Honestly. Melissa looked over her shoulder and smiled. "Mom, you're finally here." I kissed her cheek and handed her the pie. "I brought pumpkin." "You still make that every year?" she asked with a small laugh. "Some things never change, I guess." I smiled. "I suppose they don't." I didn't think much of it then. I took off my coat and looked around the room. Everything looked beautiful. Candles sat in the center of the table surrounded by pine branches and red berries. White plates had already been arranged neatly beside polished silverware. Family photos decorated the walls. Melissa and Daniel at the beach. Sophie at graduation. Vacation pictures. Smiling faces everywhere. Then I noticed something strange. I looked slowly around the room again. I don't know why it caught my attention immediately. Maybe because certain things simply feel wrong before you understand why. Maybe because when you've lived long enough, your heart notices changes before your eyes do. I looked toward the dining table one more time and suddenly my smile faded. Everyone had a place card waiting at their seat. Daniel, Melissa, Sophie. Even Daniel's brother and his wife had name cards. Then I looked at mine. And for a moment, I just stood there staring at it. Because written in elegant gold letters was one word. Guest. I stared at the little card for a few seconds longer than I should have. Guest. Just 6 letters written in soft gold lettering with tiny snowflakes around the edges. It looked elegant. Deliberate. Carefully printed like all the others. I told myself not to overthink it. People make mistakes all the time. Melissa had probably ordered them online and forgotten to personalize mine. Or maybe Sophie had made them quickly before dinner. There were dozens of harmless explanations. I had spent most of my life giving people harmless explanations. I slid my finger across the edge of the card and smiled to myself before taking my seat. Everything looks beautiful, I said as naturally as I could. Melissa glanced over while carrying a bowl of mashed potatoes toward the table. Thank you. I spent almost 2 days putting everything together. Daniel pulled out a chair and sat beside me. Sophie dropped into her seat across from mine. Everyone moved around with easy familiarity, while Christmas music drifted softly through the room. Somewhere in the background, Nat King Cole was singing about chestnuts roasting on an open fire. I folded my napkin neatly across my lap. I looked down at the place setting in front of me. White plate. Silver utensils. crystal water glass, tiny pine branch beside the card. Everything looked perfect. Maybe too perfect. Dinner started with small conversations. Daniel talked about work. Sophie shared stories about college classes and a professor she could not stand. Melissa laughed and refilled glasses while moving around the table with effortless confidence. I watched everyone and smiled at the right moments. I nodded. I asked questions. I did what I had always done. I kept things comfortable. Halfway through dinner, Daniel's brother raised his glass. To family, he said with a smile. Everyone lifted their glasses. To family. The words floated around the table gently, warmly. I lifted my glass too. Family. Such a simple word. Such a heavy one. Melissa smiled brightly and looked around the table. I love having everybody together like this. Sophie grinned. Especially Grandma's pumpkin pie. Yes, Melissa laughed. Some traditions survive forever. Everyone chuckled softly. I smiled too. Then Melissa looked directly at me and tilted her head slightly. Although honestly, Mom still acts like time stopped somewhere around 1985. There was laughter around the table. Not loud laughter. Not cruel laughter. Just enough. The kind people give when they think something is harmless. I smiled again. I even laughed a little myself. Because what else was I supposed to do? Daniel looked down at his plate. Sophie shifted in her chair. Melissa reached for her wine glass like nothing had happened. I picked up my fork and cut another small piece of turkey. I chewed slowly. I looked at the candles flickering in the middle of the table. I listened to the music. I listened to spoons touching plates. I listened to everyone talking around me. But suddenly it felt as though I had stepped a few feet away from the table even though I was still sitting there. It is strange how loneliness works. Sometimes it does not arrive when you are alone. Sometimes it arrives in rooms full of people. I looked back down at the small gold card sitting beside my plate. Guest. I stared at that word again. And for the first time that evening I had a quiet thought that slipped into my mind before I could stop it. Maybe that card was not a mistake after all. The rest of dinner moved forward the way rivers do in winter. Slowly on the surface while something colder moved underneath. I kept smiling when people looked at me. I passed dishes around the table. I complimented the turkey. I asked Daniel's brother about his new job. I even laughed at stories I barely heard. But somewhere in the middle of all that noise, my mind had become very quiet. I kept looking around the room. Not obviously. Just little glances here and there. The family photos hanging near the fireplace caught my attention first. I had noticed them when I arrived, but now I looked more carefully. There was Melissa and Daniel at the Grand Canyon last summer. Sophie smiling beside her dorm room on move-in day. Matching sweaters during Thanksgiving. A beach trip from 2 years earlier. Smiling faces. Happy moments. I stared for a few seconds longer. Then I realized something I had not noticed before. I was not in any of them. Not one. I looked away immediately and picked up my water glass. Maybe I was imagining things. Maybe there had not been enough space on the walls. Maybe there were other pictures somewhere else in the house. There are moments when your heart notices something before your mind wants to admit it. I remembered another Christmas dinner 3 years ago. Thomas had still been alive then. Melissa had insisted on taking family pictures in front of the fireplace. I remember standing beside Thomas while he wrapped his arm around my shoulders. I remember Sophie smiling between us. Then Melissa looked at the camera and laughed. Let us get one with just the immediate family too. Immediate family. At the time I had not thought much about it. Thomas squeezed my hand and smiled. We stepped aside. I told myself that was normal. Young families need their own memories too. Last Thanksgiving another memory returned. Melissa had posted pictures online. Everyone sitting around the table laughing together. I remember looking through every picture and realizing there was not a single one of me. Strange because I had spent 6 hours helping cook that day. I remembered Sophie's birthday dinner last spring too. Melissa had reserved a long table at an Italian restaurant downtown. I arrived 10 minutes late because traffic on Interstate 75 had been backed up for miles after an accident. When I got there, everyone was seated already. The only chair left was at the very end of the table beside the restroom hallway. Melissa smiled and said, "Sorry, Mom, that was the only spot left." I smiled and sat down. I remembered all of it now. Little things. Tiny moments. Pieces that had never felt important by themselves. But suddenly they started fitting together. Like puzzle pieces sitting untouched in a box for years. One by one. Click, click, click. Sophie interrupted my thoughts suddenly. Grandma. I looked up quickly. Are you okay? I blinked and smiled. Of course, sweetheart. Why? She shrugged softly. You just seem quiet. Melissa looked over while cutting a slice of pie. Mom has always been sensitive during holidays. She laughed lightly while placing whipped cream beside each plate. You know how she gets. Sensitive. I looked at Melissa for a second. She smiled as she spoke. Warm voice. Pleasant expression. Perfect daughter. Then she turned away and kept serving dessert. I looked back down at the place card beside my plate. Guest. Suddenly that word felt different now. Smaller somehow. Colder. Because I had a strange feeling growing quietly inside me. Maybe tonight had not started something new. Maybe tonight was simply the first time I had finally noticed what had already been happening for years. After dessert, the evening settled into its familiar rhythm. Plates were cleared. Coffee was poured. Soft Christmas music continued floating through the house while conversations broke into smaller pieces. Daniel and his brother moved toward the living room to watch a football game. Sophie disappeared upstairs for a phone call with a friend from college. Melissa carried dishes into the kitchen one stack at a time. I stood slowly and gathered a few empty plates. Mom, you do not have to help, Melissa called from the sink. You are our guest tonight. The word landed softly, almost casually. Guest. Again. I looked toward her. She was facing the sink with her back turned, rinsing glasses under warm water. Maybe she had not even realized what she said. Maybe she had. I walked over and set the plates beside her. Old habits are hard to break, I said with a smile. She laughed lightly. You always say that. We stood there quietly for a moment. Water ran from the faucet. Silverware clinked softly against ceramic dishes. Outside the kitchen window I could see snow falling harder now. Small white flakes moved under the porch lights like drifting pieces of paper. I dried my hands slowly with a kitchen towel and looked around the room. Melissa's kitchen had changed over the years. New cabinets. Different paint colors. New appliances. But certain things still looked familiar. The small ceramic angel by the window was one I had given her years ago. The recipe box near the coffee machine had belonged to my mother. Little pieces of history sitting quietly in corners. Sometimes I wondered if people forgot where things came from. Or if they simply stopped thinking about it. Mom! Melissa's voice pulled me back. Can you grab more napkins from the pantry? Of course. I walked toward the pantry beside the hallway and opened the door. Shelves lined with canned soup, cereal boxes, baking supplies. I reached toward the stack of napkins sitting near the bottom shelf. Then I heard voices. First I barely paid attention. Melissa had walked into the hallway with her phone. I could hear her speaking softly. I was not trying to listen. I truly was not. But then I heard my name. I know, Melissa said quietly. Silence followed. Then another small laugh. No, she still does not notice anything. I froze. My hand stayed resting against the shelf. I could hear only her side of the conversation. After New Year everything will be easier. Pause. No, I cannot bring it up now. Another pause. She gets emotional over things like that. I stared at the pantry shelf in front of me. Tomato soup. Flour. Brown sugar. Small ordinary things. My heartbeat suddenly felt louder than the voices. No, Melissa said softly again. We will talk to her after the holidays about the house. Silence. Then footsteps moved back toward the kitchen. I quickly grabbed the napkins and closed the pantry door. Melissa walked in a second later with a smile still on her face. Found them? She asked casually. I looked at her. I looked at my daughter. Same blue eyes she had as a little girl. Same smile. Same face I had kissed after nightmares and school plays and fevers and birthdays. I smiled back and handed her the napkins. Yes, I said softly. I found exactly what I was looking for. The rest of the evening felt strangely clear after that. It was almost disappointing how ordinary everything looked. Melissa walked around refilling coffee cups and laughing at stories. Daniel sat on the couch discussing football scores with his brother. Christmas lights blinked quietly beside the fireplace. Somewhere in the house I could hear Sophie laughing upstairs. Everything looked normal. Everything looked exactly the same as it had an hour earlier. But once you see a crack in glass, you stop seeing the whole window. You only see the crack. I sat down on the edge of the sofa and wrapped both hands around my coffee mug. The ceramic felt warm against my fingers. I stared into the dark coffee without drinking it. About the house. The words kept returning. Not loudly. Quietly. Like footsteps moving around in another room. I had lived in that house for 42 years. Thomas and I bought it when Melissa was 6. I still remembered the first day we walked through the front door carrying boxes while Melissa ran from room to room yelling that she wanted the bedroom facing the backyard. I remembered painting the kitchen ourselves because we could not afford contractors. I remembered Thomas standing on a ladder hanging Christmas lights every December, while pretending he needed my help handing him tools he could easily reach himself. I remembered scraped knees, birthday cakes, piano lessons, school projects spread across the dining room table. I remembered life. I had never thought of the house as walls and windows and property taxes. It was simply home. Sophie suddenly appeared beside me and dropped onto the couch. "Grandma, you disappeared for a while." I smiled softly. "I was helping your mother." Sophie studied my face for a second. She had Thomas's eyes. Not the color. The expression. Thomas always looked at people like he was listening even before they spoke. "Are you sure you are okay?" she asked quietly. "You seem different tonight." I looked down at my coffee and smiled. "Do I?" "Yes." She tucked one leg underneath herself and lowered her voice. "Grandma, can I ask you something?" I turned toward her. "Of course." She hesitated. For a moment she looked toward the kitchen to make sure nobody was nearby. Then she looked back at me. "Have Mom and Dad talked to you recently about moving?" My hand tightened slightly around the mug. Just a little. Not enough for anyone else to notice. "Moving?" I asked carefully. Sophie nodded slowly. "I do not know much. I just heard them talking a few times over the past month." She frowned. "I thought you already knew." I said nothing. Sophie looked uncomfortable now. "Grandma, maybe I should not have said anything." I forced a smile and reached over to touch her hand gently. "No, sweetheart." My voice stayed soft. Steady. "You did nothing wrong." She looked relieved but still uncertain. Then Melissa's voice floated from the kitchen. "Sophie, come help me with dessert plates." Sophie stood up slowly. "I will be right there." Before walking away, she looked back at me one more time. "Grandma." "Yes. I love you." I smiled at her. A real smile this time. "I love you too." Then she disappeared into the kitchen and I sat there alone holding my coffee while Christmas lights reflected softly in the living room window. Outside snow continued falling quietly into the dark. Inside, something else had started falling too. By the time I put on my coat that night, the snow outside had covered the sidewalks in a smooth white layer. Melissa hugged me at the door. Daniel wished me a safe drive home. Sophie wrapped her arms around me one more time and held on a little longer than usual. I smiled at everyone. I said Merry Christmas. I thanked Melissa for dinner. I kissed her cheek before stepping outside into the cold air. Then I walked slowly toward my car. The silence outside felt different. Cleaner somehow. I sat behind the steering wheel, but did not start the engine immediately. Snowflakes landed softly against the windshield under the glow of the streetlights. For a few seconds I simply sat there with both hands resting in my lap. I thought I would cry. I expected tears. I expected anger. I expected heartbreak. Instead there was only quiet. Deep quiet. The kind that settles over a lake before winter freezes the surface. I drove home slowly through nearly empty streets. Christmas lights blinked outside houses as I passed. Families sat around windows glowing with warm yellow light. Somewhere children were opening presents early. Somewhere grandparents were laughing with grandchildren. Somewhere people were probably sitting around tables believing they belonged there. I reached my driveway around 10:30 and pulled into the garage. My house greeted me with darkness and stillness. I stepped inside and turned on the kitchen light. The familiar warmth wrapped around me immediately. I placed my purse on the counter and hung my coat beside the door. Everything sat exactly where I had left it earlier that morning. The little ceramic snowman beside the sink. The Christmas cards lined across the fireplace. Thomas's old coffee mug still sitting on the shelf where I had placed it years ago and never moved again. I walked slowly through the house, turning on lamps one by one. Living room, hallway, bedroom. Soft light filled each room gently. I do not know why I did it. Maybe I simply wanted the house to feel less empty. Or maybe I wanted proof that something still belonged to me. I changed into comfortable clothes and made myself tea. Chamomile. 2 teaspoons of honey. The same way Thomas used to make it for me. I carried the mug into the living room and sat beside the Christmas tree. The lights reflected softly against old ornaments hanging from the branches. Some of them were older than Melissa herself. Tiny pieces of glass and memory collected over decades. I looked at one ornament shaped like a little red house. Melissa made it in second grade. I still remembered helping her sprinkle glitter across wet glue, while she sat at the kitchen table laughing because she had accidentally gotten glitter in her hair. I picked it up carefully and held it in my hand. Then I thought about the place card again. Guessed. I thought about the photographs on the wall. I thought about Melissa's phone call. About the house. About Sophie asking if I knew I might be moving. Piece by piece the evening replayed itself quietly in my mind. Suddenly I understood something that hurt more than anything else. People do not slowly disappear from families. They disappear one small moment at a time. One missing photograph. One forgotten seat. One little joke. One quiet decision made in another room. I stared at the Christmas tree for a long time after that. Then I placed the ornament back on the branch and took a slow sip of tea. Something inside me had changed tonight. Not broken. Changed. Because for the first time I was no longer asking myself whether I had imagined everything. I already knew the answer. The next morning I woke up earlier than usual. Sunlight was already slipping through the curtains, laying pale strips of gold across the bedroom floor. For a few seconds I stayed still beneath the blankets, listening to the quiet hum of the heater running somewhere in the house. I stared at the ceiling and tried to remember what day it was. Then I remembered. Christmas morning. Slowly the memories from the night before returned one after another. The place card. The photographs. Melissa's voice in the hallway. Sophie's worried face. Funny how truth works. Once it enters the room, it never leaves again. I sat up and looked toward Thomas's side of the bed. For years later, and I still look sometimes. Not because I expected him to be there. Just because habits survive longer than people do. I got dressed, brushed my hair, and walked downstairs. Usually Christmas morning meant cinnamon rolls and old holiday movies playing in the background. Usually I would call Melissa around 9 and ask whether Sophie liked her gifts. Usually there was excitement. Movement. Something warm waiting in the day ahead. But this morning I moved quietly through the kitchen making coffee without turning on the television. I did not even play music. I carried my mug into the dining room and sat beside the window. Snow covered the backyard in a smooth, untouched blanket. Everything outside looked clean and peaceful. I wrapped both hands around the mug and stared outside for a long time. Then I noticed something sitting on the bookshelf near the fireplace. A leather photo album. I had not opened it in years. I stood up slowly and brought it back to the table. Dust brushed lightly against my fingertips as I opened the cover. The first pages held pictures from years ago. Melissa in pigtails holding a pumpkin almost bigger than her body. Thomas teaching her to ride a bicycle in the driveway. School plays. Family vacations. Birthday cakes with crooked candles. I smiled quietly as I turned the pages. Then I reached pictures from later years. Melissa's college graduation. Her wedding day. Sophie as a baby sleeping in my arms. I kept turning pages slowly. Then I stopped. My eyes narrowed slightly. I flipped back several pages and looked again. Then forward again. Then backward. I stared at the photographs in silence. Because suddenly I noticed something strange. Beginning almost 5 years earlier, I started appearing less and less. Not all at once. Slowly. Sometimes I was standing at the edge of a group picture. Sometimes only half my shoulder appeared in the frame. Sometimes I was missing completely. I kept turning pages. Birthday dinners. Thanksgiving gatherings. Summer barbecues. Smiling faces everywhere. But fewer and fewer of me. I sat back in my chair and stared at the album resting open in front of me. Felt ridiculous at first. Pictures. Who notices things like that? Who counts appearances in family photographs? But suddenly I remembered Thomas saying something years ago, while organizing old pictures in the garage. He had laughed and held up a photo album. You can tell a lot about people by who they place in the center of the picture. At the time I thought it was just one of his little observations. Thomas always noticed things other people missed. I looked down at the photographs again. Then I looked toward the quiet living room. Suddenly I heard his voice in my mind as clearly as if he were sitting beside me. And for the first time since last night, I felt something that was not sadness. I felt curiosity. The day after Christmas passed slowly. I did not call Melissa and she did not call me. That alone felt unusual. For years we had maintained little routines between us. Quick phone calls. Questions about recipes. Updates about weather or grocery sales or things Sophie was doing at school. Small conversations. Harmless conversations. The kind that fills silence without really saying anything important. But that day my phone sat quietly on the kitchen counter beside the fruit bowl and never rang. I spent the morning putting away wrapping paper and washing dishes from the night before. Then I reorganized the hallway closet even though it did not need organizing. Around noon I folded laundry that was already folded neatly. I moved slowly through the house searching for small tasks to keep my hands busy, while my mind continued wandering elsewhere. Around 3 in the afternoon I finally sat down in Thomas's old armchair near the window. I looked outside at the backyard while holding a cup of coffee that had already gone cold. Then my phone buzzed. Melissa. I stared at the screen for a second before answering. Hi, sweetheart. Her voice sounded bright. Easy. Hi, Mom. How are you? I am doing well. Good. A pause followed. Small. Almost invisible. Then she laughed lightly. I just wanted to check on you. I know holidays can be hard sometimes. I looked out the window. Snow was slowly melting from tree branches outside. Tiny drops of water fell one by one from the fence into the grass below. That is kind of you, I said softly. Did you enjoy yesterday? She asked. Very much. Another pause. Then she continued. Daniel and I were actually talking this morning. My eyes stayed fixed on the backyard. Here it comes, I thought quietly. We were thinking maybe after New Year we could all sit down together. Her voice remained cheerful. Warm. Casual. Just family talking about future plans and things. Future plans. Interesting phrase. I remembered the phone call from the pantry. I remembered Sophie asking if I knew I might be moving. I remembered guests sitting beside my plate in gold letters. That sounds nice, I said. Wonderful. Relief seemed to enter her voice immediately. I will call you later this week. We said goodbye and I set my phone back on the table. Then I sat quietly for a long moment. I did not feel angry. Strangely enough, I did not even feel surprised anymore. Because now I understood something important. Melissa believed I knew nothing. She believed I still occupied the same place I always had. The place where I smiled and stayed quiet. The place where I accepted explanations. The place where I overlooked small things because keeping peace felt easier than asking difficult questions. I stood up and walked toward the hallway cabinet beside the stairs. I opened the lower drawer and moved aside old insurance papers and instruction manuals. Near the back sat a small wooden box. Thomas bought it during a trip to Vermont almost 20 years earlier. I lifted the lid slowly. Inside sat documents arranged neatly in folders. House paperwork. Insurance records. Bank information. Important things. Things Thomas always insisted should stay organized. I stared down at them quietly. Then I noticed something I had almost forgotten existed. A cream-colored folder resting beneath everything else. My fingers paused above it. Because suddenly I remembered Thomas placing that folder into the box years ago with a smile. And saying something that had seemed unnecessary at the time. Just in case, Ellie. You never know. I sat down slowly with the cream-colored folder resting in my lap. For a moment I did not open it. I simply stared at it while afternoon light stretched across the living room carpet. Funny how certain objects become heavier once you realize they might contain answers. My fingers moved across the cover carefully. I could still picture Thomas holding it years ago in this very room. He had smiled when he placed it into the box. Not a serious smile. Not a worried one. Just Thomas being Thomas. He had always planned ahead, always prepared for storms long before clouds appeared. I finally opened the folder and slid the papers onto my lap. The first pages were ordinary things. Insurance information, property documents, notes written in Thomas's careful handwriting. I turned another page, then another. Suddenly I stopped moving. I stared down at the paper in front of me and read it once. Then I read it again more slowly. My heartbeat stayed calm, strangely calm, because suddenly everything around me became very quiet. There was a trust agreement attached to the property records. I remembered discussing it years ago after Thomas retired, but I had completely forgotten the details. We had sat together in a lawyer's office on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, while Thomas insisted we should organize everything properly. I remembered teasing him afterward for acting like an 80-year-old man planning his future. He had laughed and squeezed my hand. "You will thank me one day, Ellie." I looked back down at the papers again. The house had not been structured the way I thought it was. It could not simply be transferred or sold through casual family conversations and emotional pressure. There were conditions, legal protections, specific instructions. Thomas had arranged everything carefully years ago. Very carefully. I sat there staring at his signature near the bottom of the page. Then I leaned back slowly against the chair and laughed. Not loudly, just a small quiet laugh that surprised even me. Because suddenly I remembered Melissa speaking in the hallway. "After New Year we will talk to her about the house." I remembered Sophie asking if I knew about moving. I remembered sitting at that Christmas table with a little card calling me guest. Guest. I looked around my living room, my house, my furniture, my memories, my life. The framed picture beside the fireplace caught my attention. Showed Thomas and me standing together on a beach in Maine almost 15 years earlier. Wind had blown my hair into my face and Thomas was laughing at something I had said. I stood up and walked over to it slowly. "You knew," I whispered softly. I smiled at the picture. "You knew something I did not." Outside the sun was beginning to set. Golden light filled the room for a few brief minutes before evening slowly approached. I looked back toward the folder resting on the chair. Then I looked toward my phone sitting quietly on the table. For days I had felt sadness, confusion, hurt, but now something else had taken their place. Not anger, not revenge, clarity, because for the first time since Christmas dinner, I was no longer sitting in the dark waiting for someone else to explain my future to me. I already had something far more valuable than explanations. I had the truth,